BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello and welcome to the Farming Today podcast with me, Charlotte Smith. In this episode, England's land use framework, vaccinating chickens, and why the government isn't backing down on inheritance tax on farms.
Those estates where people do have to pay inheritance tax will only pay it at half the rate that anyone else would have to pay. And instead of paying it all at once like anyone else, it can be staged over 10 years.
More from the DEFRA Secretary Steve Reed later. Now this week, it's 5 years since the UK left the EU. For farmers, that meant goodbye to the EU Common Agricultural Policy and the beginning of a transition to new policies drawn up separately in the different parts of the UK. The basic payment scheme, which paid farmers based on the amount of land they farmed, is already being phased out in England, and in Wales that transition will begin next year, while in Scotland and Northern Ireland it is, to some extent, being retained. New support schemes are being introduced to reward farmers for environmental work, things like habitat restoration, carbon capture and flood alleviation. So how's it all going? Well, this week we've had reports giving us a snapshot from farms across the UK on Farming Today. That's the programme that goes out each weekday morning here on Radio 4 at 5:45, or it's available anytime you like on BBC Sounds. Let's start then in Wales, where the Sustainable Farming Scheme, or SFS, should start being rolled out in 2026. As you may remember, it was delayed after farmers protested against plans to require them to have trees on 10% of their land before they were eligible for any payments. To get involved, farms will have to sign up to 12 so-called universal actions, ranging from soil health planning and habitat maintenance to continuous professional development. BBC Wales environment correspondent Stefan Messenger has been speaking to Emma Robinson on her farm near Abergavenny.
Right, we're now in the cubicle house with the cows. They're in at the minute, sort of all having a little bit of lunch before we then sort of milk them again in the afternoon.
Well, Emma, you and your husband Robert relocated here, didn't you, to Monmouthshire, cows and all, in 2014, 2 years before the vote to leave the EU and everything that triggered in terms of this big shake of agricultural subsidies.
Well, it's been quite a roller coaster, I think, really. Obviously, this scheme is very different to our basic payment scheme we had before. It's very environmentally led. There's all the universal actions you've got to contribute to into the scheme. So there's, woodland creation, there's habitat, there's hedgerow. There's also things around herd health and management. Obviously, they're thinking about bringing in sort of carbon calculation as well. There's lots to think about before you get to that stage in 26 where you have to tick a box, and it's either I stay in BPS and it's phased out, or I tick a box and go into the SFS.
For some farmers, that won't be a decision, will it? Because they're reliant on that public subsidy.
The basic payment scheme was a support payment for agriculture. It was there to help you, I think, and support you through like the difficult times in farming. And then we have to look at the financial implications of it, if it's going to be enough money.
Because that is one of the unanswered questions at the moment, isn't it? Is budget.
Budget, yeah, that's it. We don't know the budget.
Emma Robinson, County Chair for NFU Cymru in Monmouthshire. In Northern Ireland, there is a new Sustainable Agriculture Programme, presumably the SAP, as acronyms are very much encouraged in agricultural policy, and it is being introduced bit by bit. Some direct payments are being maintained, but with conditions attached, like taking part in a carbon footprinting project. New schemes are also gradually opening up to support increased efficiency, reduced carbon emissions and environmental work. But on top of a change in policy, farms in Northern Ireland have faced other challenges since Brexit because of the creation of a new border in the Irish Sea with its implications for trade with GB. The former president of the Ulster Farmers Union, Victor Chestnut, was in the thick of many of the negotiations, especially concerning the Northern Ireland Protocol, which was the first renegotiation of the original Brexit withdrawal agreement, subsequently amended as the Windsor Framework. Helen Marg went to meet Victor on the family farm near Bushmills.
We're here at my son's dairy farm. This was one of the real concerns during Brexit. He sells his milk to a southern company, and would that milk be able to go? One of the things we were worrying about was that we might have needed a veterinary certificate with every load of milk, but thankfully marketing has worked well.
What are the challenges you feel have changed your farming lives?
One of the main things on my farm here, I'm a pedigree breeder. I breed pedigree Angus, pedigree Charleys, Texel sheep, and we had been buying new genetics from across the water. That has stopped, and no genetics are able to come from UK mainland into Northern Ireland. Semen's banned under the same rules, so is embryos, and all of a sudden we're banned out of the main genetic pool.
A big issue has been about subsidies. CAP was focused on developing production, but new subsidies are based more on agri-environmental schemes and so forth. Now, what about for farms here in Northern Ireland and yourself, Victor?
Yeah, well, I like to farm with nature, and you can hear the birds chirping here, the Irish hares back in this farm and some of the things. This is a coastal farm. It was quite bare of hedges and trees. My ambition is to have a hedge round every field that I own. I'm 3/4 of the way there. But just at the minute now, when I go to buy my thornquicks, they normally would have come from Scotland, which is a similar climate to ourselves. The thorns did well. Now we're having to buy stuff from maybe Dutch, grown in a very, very different environment, so they don't do as well.
Victor Chestnut there with Helen Mark. Well, DEFRA told us ministers are working closely with industry and trade partners to ensure the smooth movement of goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland while protecting our livestock, crops and food supply chain from disease. In Scotland, 70% of the farming budget will still be used for direct payments to farmers, but with more conditions attached than before. New environmental schemes will also be introduced, but the rate of change towards the new system has been slower than elsewhere. Nancy Nicholson has been speaking to hill farmer Robert MacDonald in Speyside.
There's snow on the cairngorms. We've got, maybe 6 inches here?
Yeah.
And we're off to feed some ewes?
We're off to feed some ewes. We're feeding them silage every day at the moment. We haven't really made any major changes because the support system in Scotland remained pretty much the same since Brexit. It's been a case of wait and see for us, really.
Business as usual.
Yes.
Change is coming, though, and it's coming quite soon in terms of your support. It's coming this year. It will be different.
We have to put forward a whole farm plan, complete a health plan for the stock, a carbon audit, and we also have to complete a biodiversity audit, soil analysis as well.
There's a gate coming up. Is that my job?
Nothing for nothing here, Clancy.
Okay. So we're looking at the sheep in a big semicircle. They're just following the route that the silage was spread out on. And right round about us are hills. We're looking onto the Cromdale Hills, the cairngorms behind that, and the trees round about us. Yeah. The bottom line then, we're looking this week at the implications of the Brexit deal 5 years ago. Are you better or worse off since Brexit?
Personally speaking, we will be better off because the price of what we're selling, lambs and calves, are reaching levels that we've never seen before. You could say that that is because of Brexit, because when you look at how the suckler herd has disappeared really in England and Wales, it's decreased in Scotland and Northern Ireland, but not to the same extent. The ones of us that have stayed in the business are seeing the benefits of that now.
So in a way, Scottish farmers have benefited at the expense of farmers south of the border.
Yes, because our government has really taken its time and has waited for things to level out.
It's a tough message for farmers in England and Wales to hear, but you've got the weather to cope with, Robert.
We've got a lot of disadvantages. It's not all cream. Definitely. This is a normal winter's day here, but if this was happening further down the country, it would be news headlines.
Robert MacDonald there. Well, policy in England has changed the fastest, with direct payments already being phased out. They'll be gone entirely by 2028. They're being replaced by the Environmental Land Management Schemes, ELMS, which includes a vast number of different ways farmers can be paid for environmental work, including the entry-level Sustainable Farming Incentive, or SFI. Farmers can, of course, choose not to join any of the schemes and not get any public money. Well, Sarah Swaddling's been finding out how it's all working with beef producer and farm consultant Rob Halliday on his farm in Cornwall.
This is very typical of Cornish countryside, undulating ground, lots of hedges, smaller fields, and very much suited to livestock and livestock rearing.
How do you get the money under SFI, the Sustainable Farming Incentive then? What sort of things can you be doing to earn the money?
So there's quite a wide range of options now, everything from producing environmental plans for the farm, hedgerow management plans, hedgerow maintenance and management itself, and then there's money for doing things like planting bird feed or, in our case, quite a lot of herbal lays, a mixture of grasses, legumes and herbs, so things like chicory and plantain.
If we look at this hedge then, Rob, it's quite tall, it's got a bit of spindly growth on top. Have you been managing this as part of the Sustainable Farming Incentive?
So this hedgerow was under countryside stewardship, which we've just come out of at the end of last year and will now be rolled into our new SFI agreement. And that will probably carry on the same basis of every other year cutting. We are selecting where we can find them in the hedge, any good quality hardwoods, oaks particularly, to try and grow into hedgerow trees.
How do they calculate what you can earn?
So the hedgerow management option will be paid £13 per 100 metres per side of the hedge, and we've got just over 11 kilometres of hedgerow on this farm.
The Sustainable Farming Incentive is like a massive menu with everything on it. Is that a strength or a weakness?
It's both. Farms are not homogenous. You know, if you take us to Hampshire to the Fens, the cross section is huge. So I think you need to have the options to enable it to fit individual farms. Of course, the inherent problem with having lots of options is it becomes ever more complicated. And so probably for farmers to dip in and sign up to the scheme is quite hard work because there's an awful lot of background learning. So it is, to a point, still an agent's charter. And it would be nice to try and see if we could have the scheme to run, for farmers by farmers.
Rob Halliday in Cornwall. Some poultry farmers are appealing to the government to let them vaccinate their flocks against the bird flu virus. Vaccinating poultry against avian influenza is currently not allowed in the UK. The government says that strong biosecurity measures and culling are the most effective ways of fighting it, and there are concerns that poultry vaccinations might be linked to the virus evolving. Overall levels of the virus haven't yet reached the peak of recent years, but stricter biosecurity measures have been brought in for poultry keepers across Great Britain, and there are housing orders in place where outbreaks have taken place across much of eastern England and parts of Shropshire, where all birds must be kept indoors, including backyard flocks. Well, David Perrone of Top Farm Eggs in North Norfolk, whose birds have had to be shut in, told Anna Hill a vaccine isn't a simple fix.
Well, we're standing a good distance from the sheds.
This is about as near as we'd like to get, really for biosecurity reasons. So we have a change of footwear when we go into the egg packing station, into the egg collecting room, and then we have another set of clothing we go into the actual shed. So we'll change clothing twice. When the chickens go outside, do they dip their feet and change their feathers every time they go in and out? No. I think by housing them, you reduce the risk of bird flu by about 50%. You don't eliminate it, but you reduce it.
Well, it's just started raining. We were just going back in the farmhouse. How do you think it's going to pan out for the rest of the year?
The housing order, I think, will be rescinded probably in March, April time. The chickens will have a nice summer outside on the range. And probably... I personally think that housing orders will be an annual event. I don't think we're anywhere near getting a vaccination programme. The one in France outwardly appears to be very successful. However, the government is subsidising it. The vaccine is 50p per chicken. I have 25,000 chickens on the farm. I don't know where the quail would sit in that. And you have to have a veterinary inspection once a month.
And if that did happen, if we had a vaccination and we had to have inspections, that surely would put the price up of the egg in the shop. Well,
one would hope so.
Free-range egg producer David Perrone there. Now, to the argument that's never far from the headlines at the minute, there's a new analysis of the figures around inheritance tax on farms. The government wants to introduce inheritance tax on farm businesses with assets more than £1 million from April next year. Ministers say the change will raise money to pay for public services and estimate it will impact 500 estates a year. Well, farmers have been protesting against the move. There are more rallies due to take place across Scotland today. They argue that far more farms will be affected and that many will have to sell land to meet the tax bill. Well, the levy body, the AHDB, the Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board, has thrown its hat into the ring. As an apolitical body, it doesn't comment directly on government policy, but it has published an analysis suggesting the majority of commercial farms will be impacted by the change. David Udall is Director of Economics and Analysis.
So we've done analysis looking at the impact on farms in England and Scotland specifically, and we have found that for those that are over 50 hectares in size, there is around 42,000 farms that would be impacted. So that's around 75% of the farms in England and Scotland that are over 50 hectares.
Why have you focused on farms over 50 hectares, which is 123 acres? Because actually, if you look at the DEFRA statistics from the government, half of farm holdings in England, for example, are less than 50 hectares.
Yeah, it's a great question because, as you say, there's a significant proportion which are less than 50 hectares. But within that number, we've got around 40,000 farms that are below 20 hectares. And these are farms whereby at that asset size and asset scale, the volume of land and the value of their farm, would not be what we term as a commercial farm, and therefore wouldn't be able to generate enough assets to be impacted by this.
Now, we did ask the government about this. They say, we don't recognise this analysis. It is not possible to accurately infer an inheritance tax bill from a farm's net worth, as there are different circumstances affecting each farm, such as who owns it, the nature of ownership, how many people own it, and how affairs are planned. And that's a fair point, isn't it? Because IHT is owned by individuals, not businesses. And a farm can be owned by multiple people. So if it's worth, say, £2 million, that might be shared out between 4 or 5 people.
That's exactly right. And it's a very complicated thing that we need to look at. And we've built that into our assumptions, looking at Office of National Statistics data around the proportion of the population that are married with kids, that are widowed with kids, some that have no kids. And obviously from a farming perspective, as you mentioned, those that have more than 2 owners, potentially more than 2 siblings with partners that own parts of the business. So we have built that in. But crucially, we have to put it in as assumptions. And the reason that we've done this work isn't to create a provocative figure at all, but it's to allow our levy payers the starting point to understand, well, these are my circumstances. I am, single with no kids and have a farm or part of a family partnership. How likely am I to be impacted by this?
You have, though, ended up with some provocative figures, and there are a lot of figures being bandied around at the moment. The government estimates 500 estates a year will be impacted by these changes, because no matter how much the farm is worth, no matter what kind of ownership it's in, not everybody dies every year. So do you think that 500 is correct, too low, too high? What do you reckon?
Well, I think this is all around how you, I suppose, the assumptions that you start with. And for our work, we have looked at the value of everything as of today. And so if there were a killer disease of farmers and, there were significant farmers that died as of today, these are the numbers that would be impacted. Obviously, there is a death rate, generally around 10 in 1,000. So the numbers that we have would evidently be phased. We're not saying this would be 42,000 per year at all.
Actually, though, just doing the maths in my head here, you're coming out with a figure roughly the same as the government's. What are you hoping that farmers will do with this information that you've now given them? Are you hoping this will just drive people to go and see some advisors?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's obviously a significant amount of uncertainty that this has brought, and we've got to be very conscious. And every time we talk about this, around the the mental health impact and the anxiety that it's created and the emotion it's created. And so our advice very much is to go and understand your own farming position and your business position, and get that critical advice to understand the impact.
David Udall from the AHDB. Well, I raised inheritance tax when I spoke to the Secretary of State for the Environment yesterday. He had just launched a consultation on England's land use framework. As we have often discussed on this programme, there are a lot of demands on land, from housing to growing food and producing energy. So what should go where? Well, that is where the framework comes in. It's been talked about for years. One was almost published by the last government. But the DEFRA Secretary, Steve Reid, told me it will protect the best farmland.
What I want to do is not just maintain yields as they are now. I think we can use this to strengthen food security, so to increase food production. The climate crisis and the collapse in biodiversity are both major threats to our food security. So if we get this right, help to restore nature, as well as identify the best agricultural land and protect it from other uses, we can strengthen food security.
It does envisage change in about 19% of farmland by 2050. That's not including land for housing or infrastructure. And that goes from small changes like putting field margins around, or big changes like woodland creation or peat bog restoration. That is a lot of farmland to change, isn't it?
Well, potentially. It's all part of a consultation. But, I've spoken to farmers who have got land where they have been in previous decades growing crops, but now it frequently gets flooded because climate change means that we have more severe and intense rainfall than in the past. So what do you do with those fields, and how do you know precisely which ones are going to be affected by climate change? Well, the land use framework, the data that's part of it, will give you that information so you can take the right decision for that land. And instead of planting seed crops that may get destroyed and you lose all of your investment, perhaps that's better for growing trees that you can be paid to grow, that will help the land hold more water, that help deal with the consequences of flooding. So at a very granular level, there will be thousands of decisions like that this data will help farmers to take, so that they're maximising the benefit from their land for the future.
How will it actually work then on the ground? Would it dictate farm payments or planning decisions or energy infrastructure?
Well, that's exactly what we're asking people to help us with. What we're doing in the consultation is putting out the data, the information, so people can see what it is and what it tells them about the land. Then we're asking people, how do we use this to deliver the outcomes that we've defined? And one of those is strengthening food security. How do we use this information? So a lot of farmers have said to me they don't like the idea of lots of solar farms being built on prime agricultural land. Well, I agree with that. So can we use this to provide information to planning authorities so that we can better protect the best agricultural land and locate the solar farms somewhere else? The land use framework will help us to do that. That's how, I'm absolutely adamant about this. The land use framework is about strengthening food security and benefiting farmers to become more profitable and remain profitable into the future, despite the challenges of climate change.
I just want to ask briefly about avian flu. Some farmers want to be allowed to vaccinate their birds now. Are you looking at that?
We've got a team of people looking at that, and we will make announcements in due course.
And would you underwrite the cost?
Well, again, that'll be part of an announcement we'll make further down the line.
I just also want to put some figures to you, which we've had out this week from the AHDB, saying 75% of farms in England and Scotland, which are over 50 hectares, will be impacted by the inheritance tax changes. Now, if you work that out, it's pretty much like the number of estates per year that your own figures reckon will be affected. But does it give you pause to realise that 75% of these more commercial farms are now having to worry about this change?
Well, first of all, I don't recognise those figures. Second point is those estates, after death, where people do have to pay inheritance tax, will only pay it at half the rate that anyone else would have to pay. And instead of paying it all at once like anyone else, it can be staged over 10 years. But any farmer can speak to a tax advisor and plan their affairs to reduce their liability to the absolute minimum. And that's what I hope farmers will be doing.
There are some, though, who will find that difficult. The Office of Budget Responsibility last week highlighted the difficulties for some older farmers who may not have 7 years to give the farm away. Is there going to be wiggle room for them?
Well, none of us know what the future holds, and I don't think you can take tax decisions based on the impact on happily very, very few people. The best thing I would suggest people do is get proper tax advice and arrange their succession planning, because that way they can reduce their liability very, very dramatically.
Secretary of State for the Environment, Steve Reid. That's it from us. I'm Charlotte Smith. The producer is Heather Simons, and Farming Today this week is a BBC Audio Bristol production.